everybody, it's another What We Read episode, and it's a particularly exciting one.
Yeah,
let's be
very,
real.
very like
because we're talking about stuff we really liked.
Yeah, so far cream of the crop. So if you've gotten
cream of the crop,
so you've gotten this far, then so far these are the set of books that we've loved in like January and February. I want to say thereabouts. Yeah.
Okay, the first book I'm going to talk about actually has a pretty melancholy topic.
Oh.
The book is called When You Were Everything. This is by Ashley Woodfolk, and it's actually about a friendship breakup.
Oh.
So at the start of the book, you meet Cleo, and it has been almost a month since she's talked to her ex-best friend, Layla. And the story sort of jumps between the present timeline and the past timeline, so you see how their friendship fell apart and, you know, the fallout of that. The thing that I really appreciated about this book is we so rarely get stories where the friendship is a central focus, and we also rarely get stories where there's an emphasis on how losing a friend or a friendship breakup could really rattle you, could really change the shape of your life, especially since you thought they were going to be a constant, you know? And that is the part of the story that really struck home with me, because I've had my fair share of experiences with friendship breakups, and they are just as bad as losing someone you loved. Because they are someone you loved. And it was just interesting to see Woodfolk portray how their friendship worked, the dynamic of it prior to them falling apart, and what led to the cracks that eventually led to this split between them. I also like the fact that we get a semblance of resolution, but it's not a clear-cut one as well. We see what happens to Cleo, how she chooses to respond to the loss of her best friend and the person who was her person, who basically knew her best in the world. And we see her sort of grieving that, being angry about that, but also forgiving herself for the things that have happened, and also forgiving the friend for what she did or did not do in the story. And finding some semblance of peace and stability. And as someone who has been through her fair share of those things, that's a journey that I've rarely seen reflected on page, and it was really cool to see it reflected in such a realistic way here. I also really liked the other aspects of this story, like the main character Cleo loves Shakespeare, and she's good at English and writing, and it was just fun to have all these Shakespearean references thrown in. There's a diner in this story.
Cool. That's
a central location for some of the characters, and a library too. It's set in New York, which is always a fun thing for me.
Yeah, it's always fun.
The one thing I will say that sort of diminished a little bit how much I love this is because there's a teen drama aspect to the story and the friendship breakup that kind of, I was like, oh, honey, no. Like, I know you would do this. Like, I could see why you would do it, but I'm also like, no, this sounds like it's something straight out of Gossip Girl. Other than that, it was still very well written. I still really enjoyed the way Woodfolk wrote about this friendship breakup and, you know, kind of learning to recover after that. So definitely check it out if that's something you're in the market for. Also in heartbreaking stories, we have The Poet X, which is by Elizabeth Acevedo, and this one is about Xiomara. There's also like a sort of reading aspect to the story. Xiomara kind of feels trapped in her, you know, life in her Harlem neighborhood. She feels unheard, unseen, and the only time she feels like she can be honest is when she's spilling her feelings on the pages of her journal. But her English teacher kind of takes notice and invites her to become part of the slam poetry club at school, except that that's not something that her mom would be cool with. So the story is written in verse, and I actually listened to this one on audio because that was how it was recommended to me, and it's narrated by the author herself, and I think it just enhanced the experience of Xiomara's story. Just hearing Elizabeth Acevedo, you know, narrate and give voice to an emotion, like infuse emotion into the way that these poems are read. So brilliant. Her turns of phrase, the way she chooses to capture feelings and situations and moments with so few words is so incredible to me as someone who's very wordy. I was just like, how? I was like, she played around with poem structure. She played around with, like, I don't know, narratives and metaphors, and it's so brilliant. Like, this is also set in New York, which is another bonus. And I like that this one is more, it's less about the external conflicts of friendship and that type of thing, because in the story Xiomara has great friends. She also has like great peers at school. It's more like her trying to come to terms with who she is and what she wants, and also trying to fit into her family and figure out how to maintain the relationship with her brother, with her mother, with her father. It was so good. Like, the questioning felt so realistic. The expression was so unique. And I just really, it all came together so wonderfully. And I have heard nothing but praise for this book. even before I read it. And like, not to add to the hype train on it, but like, how could I not when it was so good? Like, it was just so brilliant. I am so glad I finally decided to read this one. I would highly recommend checking it out. If you think a novel in verse is not for you, maybe going the audiobook route might help you with that, because it flows so well when Elizabeth Acevedo narrates it, and I cannot recommend this enough. I cried multiple times reading this book just because I'm like, I can relate to how you feel, girl. It was a great book, obviously. I clearly really loved it, and I would highly recommend it. I would highly recommend it.
I dig that.
All right, about 10.
Right, so in absolute direct contrast, Pinocchio, Vampire Slayer. That's right, that's where we're going, right? Straight from that
into Pinocchio Vampire.
Into Pinocchio Vampire Slayer. And
because why not?
And I appreciated it, honestly. I didn't think it started out pretty clunky and quirky, but I realized that the clunk was more just my lenses when I looked at it, because every sort of main arc, actually every sort of volume. So I read 2 volumes of this, right? And every volume starts, or every backstory as well starts with sort of like a comic strip type. Black and white rendering of, I'm pretty sure the whole thing was black and white, rendering of just sort of like a pastiche of what happened in the past so far, and tells the Pinocchio tale, him being carved out of, sort of like enchanted wood, and then, with the Geppetto, and the fairy. But then we sort of, drop in on Pinocchio at a time where, Geppetto had been killed by vampires. And if not for good old Pinocchio being such an amazing liar, he wouldn't have the stakes to kill the vampires with.
Stakes.
I mean, it's sort of woven into the lore where he'll just like say a couple of things. And, so on the one hand, Pinocchio lying serves as an amazing sort of like foil, because he just lies and his nose sort of extends. He breaks the tip of it off and just starts shanking vampires and killing them. However, it also serves as a comedic foil, because he'll say something, and if his nose doesn't grow, it's true.
It's true.
Or if his nose does grow, it's a lie. So it makes for fun banter, right? Where he's like so indignant, and he's like, it's gonna be this way, and then his nose starts to grow. He's like, ah, dang it. So that's fun. But at the same time, it also every so often serves as a foil to like, not as for the plot. I want to say, where he'll say something, it's all going to be all right, and then it doesn't, and then his nose does grow, so it's like, oh man, what's going on? So it gives it that lore relationship and just like action level sort of thing where it's kind of dumb but funny. So if you like vampires and vampire slaying, and you like Pinocchio, read it. It's great. That's such a hyper specific set of data points.
Yeah.
That's like saying if you like moose, fezzes, and Lysol, it's almost Bill.
Fezzes and Lysol.
This book has everything. It's almost Bill Hader and like random, New York's hottest club is, it's almost that level of absurdia, because who would put Pinocchio and Vampire Slayers in the thing? But the twists are good. I highly appreciate the deep dive into the lore. And every aspect of the lore. So I mean, the only thing I haven't seen are the kids turning into donkeys piece of the whole story. But everything that we sort of know about the Pinocchio I don't know if that was a Disney thing or not, but everything that we know about Pinocchio so far has been sort of like transfigured into this retelling, and I am living for it. All right, so next thing I want to say, speaking of retellings, Once and Future by Kieran Gillen. So good that I had to get the second volume, which I will read in a bit. Kieran Gillen, it's notable for things like The Wicked and the Divine. And a bunch of, he's written for Marvel, DC. He's one of the most prominent writers. And personally, suddenly one of my favorites all of a sudden, now that I see how much of his work that I actually really like, and read and collect. Like that's the thing. It's like if I read it because I've got a free service, and then I liked it, sure. But if I read it and I'm just like, I gotta get me some of this, outside of it and make sure that it's mine and it's in my collection, so even if my subscription ends or whatever, then it does mean something. It's a retelling of the Arthurian legends, so much so that if and by the way, the art by Dan Mora is amazing, and I hope I got his name right. Yep, that's right, Dan Mora. The art is just great. And just even the synopsis, right? It's like there's a group of nationalists use an ancient artifact to bring a villain from an Arthurian myth back to life. Full stop. Okay, cool, nice setup, action-y type deal, mythology. It segues right into ex-monster hunter Bridget McGuire escapes from her retirement home and puts her unsuspecting grandson Duncan, a museum curator, into a world of magic and mysticism to defeat the legendary threat. It doubles down on that. Like, this synopsis, as cool as it is, doubles down. The art is great. Just seeing Bridget with like, you know, AK-47s and swords, and, you know, talking about things like the Spear of Destiny, and revealing to her sort of grandson that, hey, guess what? I used to kill monsters back in my day. And for
Casual.
it's so good. For anyone who's seen that Tumblr post about how, you know, all these chosen ones are like, you know, young females or young males. I want a chosen one that's like an 85-year-old Nana just crocheting, knitting her way through. Well, no knitting here, just a lot of like, you know, like decapitation and beheadings and, you know, like shooting and whatever. For her to be completely sort of in charge, and for like the grandson to just be like, I'm a museum curator, you know, like it's just a great... It's a great dynamic. If only for that you gotta read it, but it hits all of the beats for great action. It's very, very well paced. I would like to say that the banter is exquisite. I appreciate that so much, and it really does do the whole Arthurian thing kind of well. So I highly recommend anybody to go pick it up. If you're not into comics, it doesn't read like comics, where there's like too many panels and the art is a little inaccessible. Here, it feels like a modern day sort of like cartoon or series, just, you know, in stills. And then with like, you know, so it's very well laid out as well, so it's very accessible. So
cool.
I highly recommend that. Last but certainly not least, and easily my favorite of the three, even if, you know, it was sort of like a Hinterkind by Ian Egginton. I think this might have been like a European sort of thing that they just translated into English. I'm not too sure. But it's basically post-apocalyptic.
Okay.
It centers around sort of like a colony of humans living in Central Park. Or whatever's left of it, right? A plague had destroyed the entire world. These remnants are basically the ones who sort of survived, and you know, they sort of they survived the plague. They sort of wanted to venture out, but then suddenly they realized that out there, outside of things, whatever brings them out, are creatures from myth that have now resurfaced. And I thought that was kind of insane, because, you know, it's almost kind of like, though I haven't watched it fully, but it's almost kind of like that Will Smith movie on Netflix where, you know, like suddenly he's like his you know, he's on the police force and his partner's an orc. You know, it's like mythical creatures have like been introduced into the world. Here it's sort of the exact opposite. Now that, you know, now the humans are practically nigh extinct, right? The She have come back, and all other mystical elements of the Fae and the Fae whatever, they're all here, and they've obviously been walking among us this entire time. But now that they're sort of the dominant set of races, you've got skinlings and all of these other things.
Sure.
And so how will our little merry band of humans survive? It follows multi, you know, sort of like threads in bite-sized chunks. So it's not Game of Thronesy, but it is that level. Like, it's that level of the way George R. R. Martin sort of like, there's this person's character arc and that person's character arc. But here it's more accessible is, I guess, the best word that I have for all three of these things, because there's a way that you can dig into this without having to be a comics fan. And we have, even Fables was a little more complex than this, because it's, you know, but here it's really just, these are the fairies, these are the thing. It's all very nice, and here's your next piece of information, and here's your next little revelation, chew on that. And then the only complaint that I have was they were building it up so high. I don't know, did they run out of funding? Was it a Neon Genesis Evangelion type? Oh wait, no, that was his and her circumstances who ran out of funding. What's your excuse, Eva? That's what we called it back home. Because suddenly it ended so abruptly. There was 20 billion huge things coming up that could have been like 12 seasons. Well, not 12 seasons, like 4 seasons at the very least. But then Hinterkind only ends on the 3rd volume. And it's written from the Book of Monday. You will find out why towards the end. It's narrated in past, you know, sort of like tense. So it's great. It's got that Gossip Girl kind of thing meets, you know, Game of Thrones meets, like, you know, every mythological post-apocalypse. It's singular in its own thing. I can't say that the characters are like, oh my god, these are my favorite characters in the whole world, but they're compelling enough that you want to know what happens next, and you sympathize with them, and it's just such a wild ride. And I'm so glad that I had to get like issues 2 and 3. Like, again, Comixology, #1's free. If you're hooked, get in there. And I mean, by hooked, I mean hooked up. And if not, well, you know, give it a shot. It's your library might have it. It's really, really awesome to sort of like get into.
Cool. Okay, back to me and my fantasy reading now.
Lol.
So the book I'm going to talk about is actually I'm not talking about 2 books because I'm talking about a duology. I reread Fable by Adrian Young, and I also read the sequel Namesake, which the cover will show up here, and they're complementary. Fable is about a young woman named Fable, and when she was preteen, I guess, she was left on the island of Jebel, which is an island of thieves and murderers, and she had to try to survive until she could scrape up enough money to hire someone to take her off the island and to her father so that she could be on his crew. That's the short version of it. And you guys know I love this book. I talked about it last year, I'm sure, and it was so much fun and so enjoyable. I am always down for a sea adventure, and that is exactly what you get with Fable. You uncover the history between her and her father, what really happened. You also uncover Fable's own secrets in the story, and you get to see her find a new family with the crew that she ends up with at some point in the book. And I really enjoyed the first book, but it ended in a way where I was like, and I need to wait for the second book, really? So I finally read the second book as well, and I enjoyed it just as much. Both books have that quality that comes with Adrienne Young's writing, where it's so readable, and like once you pick it up, it's really hard to set down because she paces it so well. She chooses to be less wordy on the descriptions and instead give you just enough so that you can picture the characters, the world, the lore in your mind, but it won't take away from you just following along with the plot, which is exciting. And it's really written in a way where it feels like a movie. So the entire time I was like, this reminds me of Pirates of the Caribbean, especially book 2. There's like, it has those vibes so strong. And as someone who enjoys that franchise so much, I was like, I'm here for it, I'm here for it. It was really easy to root for Fable, obviously. Since book 1, I have been a huge fan of hers. I have loved getting to know her and seeing how she comes into her own in book 1 and then keeps her own in book 2 is really cool. I love seeing all her relationships kind of, you know, either flourish or fail, depending on who we're talking about. It was, again, another seafaring adventure. At least some of it was still a seafaring adventure. And there are faces both familiar and new that we meet in the second book that just apparently because I could not figure out where the storyline was going to go at first with the second book. I will say that it took off and it wouldn't let me go until I reached the ending of it. So it was very enjoyable. Would highly recommend Fable, would highly recommend Namesake, would recommend that you read them back to back actually, because it's probably the best way to experience those books. But yeah, it was so good. And we're obviously going to end the video on a high note because this is obviously going to be one of my favorite books of the year. Predictably, if you know anything about me, if you've been following this channel since 2012, you'll know I'm a Sarah J. Maas fan. Her storytelling style and her writing have always just worked for me. It really clicks with me on a level that very few authors can. And so obviously I'm going to be talking about A Court of Silver Flames.
Of course
This is the latest installment in her A Court of Thorns and Roses series, world. It's technically a spin-off companion to the first trilogy and novella. And this one actually has a different set of characters that we follow. We follow Nesta Archeron, who we meet in the first book. She is Feyre's sister, and she's proud and prickly and smart and, you know, she's kind of a fighter, basically. In this book, she's struggling with the fallout of all the traumatic events that occurred in the trilogy. She also has her own emotional upheaval to try and make sense of. And she has lots of ties to the Inner Court, who we meet in the trilogy, specifically to the battle-scarred Illyrian warrior named Cassian. Oh, and to top it all off, there is apparently a brewing conspiracy that might just result in another war, which I don't think anyone wants to happen at this point. And I'll leave the summary at that, although there is a lot more going on in this book. Obviously, you'll probably need to have finished the original trilogy to make heads or tails of what's actually going on in here, because there are so many references to things that happen throughout the course of the books. And you also won't really get a sense of what Nesta has been through if you haven't really read the rest of it. But it was so good. Oh my gosh. I also read this in basically one sitting. I just sat down and was like, I'm gonna read it. And then it was like 4:30 a.m. and I was like, yeah, been emotionally decimated. Thank you very much. I mean, I knew it was gonna happen, but also I loved being back in this world. Like, I still think the Throne of Glass series is my favorite of all the books Sarah has written so far. But this book just reminded me how much I love the elements of the world in the ACOTAR series, and I love the characters so much too. It was so much fun being reunited with so many familiar faces, both people that I tolerate and people that I actually love, and it was nice to get a different perspective on them. We also get to meet new characters, we discover more about this world. There's so much going on. This is on top of the fact that this is actually one of my favorite types of fantasy stories where a character really has to work through their own individual emotional journey. Sure, there's like the B plot of like there's a journey quest thing, there's that brewing war thing, and there's like other stuff going on around it, but this is actually really mostly Nesta's story and her just trying to come to terms with where she is now, what brought her to that place, how she's feeling about it, and how she's feeling about everyone else. And it's just so it was so good. Like, I had so many feelings about Nesta's story. Like, I just went through all the ups and downs with her, and it was worth it. It was just so satisfying to watch her overcome the things that had been holding her back and holding her down. And I just, oh, I loved it so much. It was just so good. It's my favorite of the series by far. Like, I would get into it further, but like, spoilers. But it's definitely my favorite of the series so far. It's set up so that the next book, which is supposedly a companion novel, probably will have a different narrator. It's set up so that this one feels like a standalone in a good way. And oh my god, I can't tell you how much I just love every time Sarah releases a book so that I can be immersed back in her writing and her worlds. Like, honestly, just keep writing me all the books forever, thank you. But really, it's such a good book. Highly recommend if you are a fan of the ACOTAR series, but you'll have to read the ACOTAR series first before you can even pick this one up. And unless you are fine with being mildly confused, in which case, you can try. Anyway, I love this book. Obviously, it's definitely going to be one of my favorites of the year. And that is the last book that we're going to talk about for this What We Read. If you have any thoughts, let us know in the comments, and you can also find us on all our other social media. It's all linked down below, and we'll see you guys in our next video. Bye!